The Sandman, Volume 1, Preludes and Nocturnes by Neil Gaiman, and also all these other people, illustrated by these folks, introduction by Karen Berger. So this is another graphic novel. You can see here it's a library book. Got this out of the library. And if you've been watching this channel the past few weeks, you know I've been getting into the graphic novels in my library and making a bit of a project of reading through them and reviewing them for whatever that may or may not be worth. I was a big comic book fan once upon a time in the early 90s, and have been getting back into it recently, partly for fun and partly just to explore the library. Anyways, The Sandman is quite famous, a huge critical acclaim and a big fan base there. I really know very little about The Sandman. So I'll talk a little bit about my history with The Sandman, such as it is. I don't really have much of a history with The Sandman, other than I was actively reading DC Comics in the early 90s, and Sandman was being published by DC Comics in the early 90s. I never picked up any Sandman titles, but if you were reading comic books at that time, no doubt you remember anytime you picked up one comic book issue, there would be ads for other comic books in that issue. I assume they still do that, although I haven't bought a new comic book in decades. They still do that, right? Do they even still publish comic books anymore? The Sandman was definitely something I remember hearing about in the orbit of DC Comics, seeing ads for it inside other DC Comics. It was published at that time by Vertigo, which was the label for DC's mature comics. And you can see even here, suggested for mature readers. Now, the late 80s and 90s were a time when comic books in general had a bit of a hard edge to them. They were going through that phase of gritty and dark, super violent heroes, which I was more of a fan of the classic image of superheroes. I mean, I came from a sheltered Christian upbringing. Maybe that explains some of my ambivalence about it. But I wasn't really interested in seeking out comics that were for more mature readers. I thought the comics that they were already making were dark and gritty enough. And I assumed at the time that imprints like Vertigo, which DC had run for its more mature line, was for stuff that was mostly just for shock value, for edgelords. I don't know if I would have used that vocabulary at the time, but that was definitely the kind of image I had for it. However, in the years since, Sandman has gotten more and more critical acclaim and built up more and more of a reputation. So that over the years, I gradually realized that I probably have missed something. And I think that somewhat goes hand in hand with Neil Gaiman's reputation. He's got a reputation now which was only just beginning in the late 80s and early 90s as a master storyteller. I've read a couple Neil Gaiman books and talked about them on my blog. I'll link to them down below in the description below. American Gods, which I gave a mixed review to. The other one, did they mention this somewhere? His collaboration with Terry Pratchett. Here we go. Good Omens, uh, which was co-authored with Terry Pratchett, but I also read that and enjoyed that quite a bit. And then if movies count, what was that the name of that movie? The Star. Sorry, I'm blanking on the name. That Starlight or something. That movie based on one of his books came out a few years ago. Saw that. But mostly, I like a lot of people. I'm just familiar with Neil Gaiman through reputation. You know, he seems to be cited so much as a master of fantasy, and the Sandman is something that frequently pops up as part of his legend. Yeah, I think this the Sandman is where he gained his fame. Is that right? Where he first came to real prominence. So when I saw this in the library, I decided, okay, I should check this out. I am way overdue for checking out Sandman. Now, this, as you can see, is volume one. It contains the first 8 issues published in the Sandman series. I think the Sandman series, according to Wikipedia, I think goes up to 75 issues. And at issue 75, Neil Gaiman decided to wrap it up because he didn't want the story to go on and become stale. I kind of had this feeling even before I looked through this that I had heard somewhere or other that the Sandman takes a few issues before it really comes into its own. And sure enough, that is confirmed right even within these pages. The introduction by Karen Berger essentially says these first few issues, it's still getting its feet. It doesn't really take off until later, which is, I don't know, kind of an interesting thing to put right in your own introduction. At least they're being honest, or maybe they just want you to buy the later books. I think Wikipedia says something similar. But at the same time, I figured volume one is a good place to start. Now, unfortunately, I'm out here in Vietnam, so my access to books in general is limited. And my library, I think, only has this one volume. So, for the moment, this is going to be the extent of my foray into the Sandman. I might, at some point in the future, track down future volumes. I don't know. A few years ago, I would have said to myself, well, if I can't read the whole series, I'm not going to bother getting started with volume one. I'll just wait till I'm at a point in my life where I can read the whole series all at once. But I've since realized that you just have to read stuff when you come across it instead of waiting for a perfect time when you're all set up with the whole series. And then at some point, who knows when, at some point in the future, maybe I'll read future books in the series. Maybe I'll have to reread this at some point to remind myself. But yeah, I decided to pick this up and start with it. I should mention, actually, another one of the reasons that I had limited interest in this in the 90s was because I didn't see it connecting to the rest of DC Comics continuity. I was very interested at that time, as a lot of adolescent comic book geeks are, in the concept of continuity, the fact that it all ties together, and past issues can be recalled later. That was a whole fascination with comic books at the time. And Vertigo I viewed as being outside of that continuity, although I'm not entirely sure that was correct. And we'll look at some of these issues here and the various connections they have to DC Comics continuity. Although these first few issues here were before Vertigo was established. So I think these first few issues were published in '88 or something. Vertigo didn't get established until the early '90s, and I think the Sandman was considered its flagship comic. Um, but I think they still had the label for mature audiences on them. Given the content of some of these issues, I certainly hope they were published with the label for mature audiences only. They must have been. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure what the connection is between the Vertigo stories and mainstream DC continuity. This is something I've actually tried to look up on Wikipedia in some of the subsequent years, and found that the answer seems to be kind of vague. I mean, it's kind of connected and it's kind of not. I don't know. But yeah, we'll look at this maybe in some of the connections with other DC Comics continuity. Wikipedia is amazingly helpful in sorting out all these things. Of course, Wikipedia wasn't around in the early '90s when I was looking at comic books. DC comic books at that time, they had reset their continuity during Crisis, but Crisis was a little bit confusing figuring out what exactly it had reset and what exactly it hadn't reset. The comic books at the time, you definitely got the sense that they were playing to an audience with long memories. And I think the continuity of DC Comics really started in the 70s. I mean, in the 60s with the Silver Age of Comics, that was when all those superheroes got revived. But I think in the 60s it was just one-off adventures. I think the idea of a gradual building, evolving continuity didn't take place until the 70s. That's the impression I get, at least. And I think you definitely got the impression in the early '90s that a lot of these comics were playing towards adults who had been reading since the 1970s. Now, for a new reader like me, somebody who was an adolescent in the early '90s, how you would exactly sort through that continuity, because you couldn't just go through and read the back issues. Those back issues were hard to find, usually incredibly expensive, because the older stuff got, the more expensive it was, especially during the collector's boom, which was going on during the '90s. Now with Wikipedia, of course, I can look all this stuff up and figure out the origins of all these characters that I had no clue about at the time, including the Sandman. Which, if you go to Wikipedia, you can read all about the various Sandmen who have been part of DC continuity. The earliest one is Wesley Dodds, who was in the 1930s and 40s during the golden age of comics, was the original Sandman. Then it's all on Wikipedia, but I think it was revived by a couple times. Jack Kirby had a run on it during his stint at DC in the 1970s. I think Neil Gaiman was influenced by Kirby's run on the character. He wanted to revive it. DC Comics originally told him no, and then they told him, yes, you can do it, but you have to create an all-new character for the Sandman. So Kirby does create an all-new Sandman. His character is like the god of dreams, is the Sandman. So there are references to DC continuity in the older characters using the name the Sandman. But this is an all-new character that started here. Now, I don't know if I should give a spoiler warning at this point. If you're not familiar with these stories, like I was, there is some pleasure in just going in blind, like I did. So you start here. It says June 6, 1916, Witch crossed England. So starting way back in 1916, you're like, all right, where is this going? How is this going to connect to the what's going on in the modern day? And just seeing how that gradually unfolds is interesting. The first story in here is maybe one of the strongest or one of the most interesting. So check this out yourself, maybe, if you haven't yet. But I'm going to go ahead and talk about this. So I guess spoiler warning. So when trying, there are these people in the occult, and when trying to summon death, they actually summon the Lord of Dreams instead. Here he is. Here he's got a helmet and an amulet and a pouch. But they imprison him anyways, and they want him to give them power and immortality as a condition for his release. But he refuses to do it. So yeah. Hello? You don't have to be in there, The deal's still the same one that my father offered you. Power, immortality, a promise that you won't seek revenge. Well, I know you can understand me. Say something. No. So he just stays imprisoned all this time. Meanwhile, his various tools end up in various places. The mask gets traded to a demon. The amulet gets stolen by his wife, the wife of the guy who imprisoned him. The pouch disappears somewhere. It's a bit of a mystery at first. So eventually the Sandman does escape from his imprisonment. But because he's been imprisoned for so long, the dream world has gone awry in his absence. Now, if I'm getting into my criticisms of the story, this is something that didn't entirely make sense to me. I don't know if this would have made sense in future issues or been explained in future issues. It's explained that all these people are having trouble sleeping or dreaming because the Lord of Dreams is in captivity. But all these people, meaning just like this handful of people, so presumably everybody else is dreaming normally? I mean, if we had sort of 80 years where everyone's sleep was disrupted in the DC universe, there's certainly been no other hints of that in the other comics. I mean, we do have a retcon here where the original Sandman, turns out his origin story is connected to this period where dreams are being disrupted. So, yeah. The universe knows someone is missing and slowly it attempts to replace him. Wesley Dodd's nightmares have stopped since he started going out at night. So he gets some sort of urge to go out at night as the Sandman because the universe knows that the original Sandman is missing. But, I mean, what about everybody else in the DC universe? Are they not having trouble sleeping? Anyways, the Sandman gets out, and then the rest of these issues are attempts to regain his powers and regain his tools with various tie-ins to other characters in the DC universe. So here we have in issue 2, Cain and Abel. So they are two brothers, and they are locked in the cycle where Cain repeatedly kills Abel. But then Abel will come back to life because they're both immortal. I guess it's like a you killed Kinney type deal. So Abel had been dead for a couple of hours, but he was starting to feel better. So Cain keeps killing him, but he keeps coming back to life. Now, when I originally read this section, before I looked this up on Wikipedia, I thought, this is really a cheap allusion to biblical mythology. Because I had known everyone praises the Sandman for integrating mythology into the comics. And granted, a lot of this praise supposedly comes from the later issues when the series supposedly really came into its own. Issues I haven't yet read. But what am I, having frequented comic book um, criticism circles for a long time in my youth, one of the things that's grown to bug me over the years is giving too much praise to references. Praising how there are all these biblical allusions when this is really just a very sloppy reference to Cain and Abel here, in my opinion. A very cheap reference where Cain just repeatedly keeps killing Abel, but it's not clear what the broader commentary is. But I say that with all that with a but coming. I looked it up on Wikipedia, and this is actually not an allusion to the biblical Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel had been DC comic book characters since like the 1950s or the 1970s. I think Cain was had like a series, The House of Cain. That was a 1950s comic book series. Sorry, 1950s horror comic book series back when those were in vogue. Later, Abel got added to the series, and Cain killing Abel was a reoccurring bit that would occur with these characters, and there was a tie-in to the 1970s version of the Sandman. Cain had a gargoyle named Gregory, which was in those comics. So once I realized that Neil Gaiman wasn't riffing off of the biblical Cain and Abel, but the DC comic books universe version of Cain and Abel, which had been kicking around in DC Comics for some time, then I thought, oh, okay, well, that's all right then. He's taking. I mean, maybe you could criticize the original introduction of Cain and Abel into DC Comics as something that's a little bit cheap, but comic books do this kind of things all the time, right? All the characters from Greek mythology end up in the comic books. So, yeah, realizing that these are callbacks to characters from the 1970s or earlier, who are now supporting characters in the Sandman series, made that more interesting for me. And there are a lot of things like that in here. I mean, like I said, how anyone ever made sense of comic books before Wikipedia, unless you'd been reading continuously with it through the 1970s, is a little bit beyond me. Although like a lot of comic book fans in the early 90s, even though I didn't understand half of the references to comic book continuity, just the general idea that there was this rich history of comic books that was out there somewhere made the stories very intriguing to me, even though before Wikipedia I was never able to put the puzzles together. It was still fun collecting back issues, gradually trying to figure out what those pieces of the puzzle were. I think Steve Donahue said on his channel once, new comic book fans enjoyed the challenge back in the days when comic books had a very rich continuity before they reset everything a million different times. But yeah, the Sandman joins up with John Constantine, who's most famous, I think, nowadays for movies made out of him, but he was a character in DC comic books continuity, appeared in the Swamp Thing. There are, this demon here in hell. I looked him up on Wikipedia. I wouldn't have known this, but would have Jack Kirby's creations from the 1970s. It turns out even hell in DC comic books has its own convoluted continuity. So when the Sandman goes into hell, he's meant by Lucifer, but Lucifer is no longer ruling hell alone. There's a triumvirate of the demon Azazel and Beelzebub, and they're ruling hell as a triumvirate. This is apparently something that happened earlier in DC comic books continuity in the Swamp Thing or something. Again, I'm relying on Wikipedia for a lot of this. Arkham Asylum and the Scarecrow, and then this is one of the main antagonists in these first few issues. His name is Dr. Destiny, or something like that. And he is from the Justice League comic books. In fact, there's a brief crossover here with characters from the Justice League. So Scott Free from Jack Kirby's Fourth World series, which is another leftover bit of DC continuity from the 1970s. And again, something I really was not able to piece together until Wikipedia came out in like 2006. When I was reading DC comic books in the 1990s, I had no idea who Mr. Miracle was or why he was on the Justice League. It was until years later that I found out about Jack Kirby's Fourth World series. Again, how anyone ever made sense of comic book continuity before Wikipedia, unless you'd been alive since the 1970s, or reading comic books since the 1970s. And the Martian Manhunter, also on the Justice League. Somewhere here, there's a picture of Batman and Green Lantern. It's only a picture of them. They don't actually appear in the story, but in the flashback to describe how Dr. Destiny was captured. Here we go. Dr. Destiny being captured by the Justice League. This is when the Sandman is trying to figure out what happened to all his tools. And what else? Sorry, I know I'm going off a bit on a bit of a tangent here, but having kind of viewed comic book continuity as this huge puzzle when I was reading comic books in the early 90s, it intrigues me to see how the Sandman fits into that puzzle. What the various pieces are. And again, after having read this comic, I did spend some time on Wikipedia looking a lot of this stuff up. Now, according to Wikipedia, and actually according to the publisher's introduction as well, Sandman was unique in that it captured a lot of readers who normally didn't read comic books. Both Wikipedia and this introduction by Karen Berger make a big deal about saying that one of the achievements of it was it got a lot of women in their 20s to read comic books. Sandman also had a disproportionate number of women who read the series, probably the most of any mainstream comic. Now, I don't know what that disproportionate number is. It could be, instead of 1%, it was 5% or something like that. But she says, in a medium that is still widely occupied by males, that in itself is a major achievement. Although, again, I think she's talking about the later issues. I think these first 8 issues are when the series was still finding its feet and still finding its fan base. Apparently, it gets much better. And I think, along with that, the connections to the convoluted DC continuity supposedly become less as the series goes on. So, like the Justice League appearing in these first 8 issues, even a brief cameo like that is something that I don't think happens in the later issues, or certainly doesn't. That's the impression that I got. So perhaps the connection with DC Comics continuity will become a lot less. But you would definitely notice that the tone of these comics are different, and again, it's suggested for mature readers. Neil Gaiman himself says he was going for a gothic horror story vibe. He says that himself here in the afterword. Gothic horror story vibe in this first story, and I think he accomplishes that well. So some of these are going for more modern horror, creepy vibes. Yeah. In the middle of this, there's a part where Dr. Destiny, who's comes from Justice League Comics continuity, but is now one of the Sandman's antagonists. He's captured the Sandman's amulet, so he's able to have some control over dreams and reality. And he's in a diner, and he just tortures all the people in the diner, making them confess all the horrible things they've done, making them self-mutilate themselves. And it gets really dark. Now, the self-mutilation, I guess, could be more graphic. But it's enough as it is. And some of the things they confess to, there's a rather detailed description of necrophilia, somebody having sex with a dead corpse, which I'm not going to read out, partly because I don't want to spoil anyone's lunch, and partly because it probably would violate YouTube guidelines or something like that to repeat it in such graphic detail. So definitely suggested for mature readers is not kidding here. And this is the kind of thing here where I think to myself, okay, is this really genius storytelling at work, or is this just edgelord stuff, just being shocking for the sake of being shocking? Is there something revealing about the human condition by describing that incident of necrophilia, or is this unnecessary? And I'm going towards unnecessary here. Although, yeah, again, Neil Gaiman was trying to create something horrific here. He was going for a modern horror story, as he says in the afterwards. And I guess it definitely is that. And then in the last issue of this edition, issue number 8, death is introduced. The personification of death as the older brother of Dream. Dream being the main character, but here is death. And this is mentioned as a turning point in the series. I think Death will go on to be one of the big characters in the series and one of the breakout stars. And, she's got a little bit of an indie punk rock to her. Maybe more than a little bit. So I don't know if this was what attracted college-age women to this comic book in the early 90s or whatever. I don't know. I here again, I feel like, the danger with coming to this comic book at this point in time is it's been so heavily praised. I'm expecting something to just completely knock my socks off. And I'm finding myself a little bit unimpressed. Maybe that's the danger of high expectations. But all this praise for the character of Death is like an interesting take on the character or the personification of death. I don't know. I mean, the thing is, Death here is actually very kind. She approaches people who are dying. The impression I get from this comic is that she is not so much the decider of their deaths as simply the messenger. Somebody, I guess, in Greek mythology, it was the fates who decided when you were going to die, right? I don't know who's deciding when you die in the Sandman universe. But death just comes along as like a pretty face to welcome you into the afterlife. Now, how she could possibly be with everybody when they die is, there's a little bit of Santa Claus logic here, right? Because somebody dies once every 3 seconds in the world. Is that statistic still accurate? So here it shows her just going to a handful of people around New York. But I'm not sure if this is in a time when I'm supposed to suspend my disbelief and not be so critical, or I don't know. But I felt like there's some musings here about the nature of death and humans' fear of death and our relationship with mortality. But I felt like it was just all surface level stuff. I mean, the question of death is the great philosophical question, right? That's something that I think somebody said all philosophy is based off of human beings' fear of death. So if you're going to broach this question, you probably want to have something new to say about it. And I don't think it really does here. I find myself wondering about humanity. Their attitude to my sister, his sister's death, my sister's gift is so strange. Why do they fear the sunless lands? It is as natural to die as it is to be born. But they fear her, dread her, feebly attempt to placate her. They do not love her. Yeah, it goes on here, I guess, trying to emphasize that, death is just a natural part of life, and it is, but you can't hand wave away human beings' fear of death with just that cheap platitudes like that. But yeah, death only really shows up in issue 8. There are other issues as well where I thought, like he's got this duel with the demon here to recover his lost helmet. This is when he's in the land of hell. And they have I guess the way these duels take place is like a wizard's duel, like from the Sword in the Stone movie. They transform into different things, or I guess they're not actively transforming. They're just saying what they would transform into, and this is the form that the duel takes. And then the demon throws a curveball by saying, I am an anthrax, butcher bacterium, worm life-destroying. Okay, well that's the same thing that was in The Sword in the Stone, though, right? That Disney movie when Merlin changed himself into a bacteria or a virus to defeat Mim. So that doesn't get a lot of points to me for being clever. But then he says, I am a world space floating, life nurturing. The demon says, I am a nova all exploding, planet cremating. I'm the universe, all things encompassing, all life embracing. Like, what are even the rules of this game, huh? I am anti-life. Now, anti-life, I think, is another reference to DC comic books continuity, right? That's referring to Jack Kirby's Fourth World in the 1970s, the quest for anti-life. So, okay, maybe that gets a point for comic book continuity. But the beast of judgment, I am the dark at the end of everything, the ends of the universes, God's worlds of everything. Well, I mean, what are the rules in this contest? If that's on the table, why not go for that from the first turn? And then he says, and what then will Sorry. And what will you be then, Dream Lord? I am hope. And the demon has no way to respond to it. So he wins the battle. Now, I don't know. Is that clever or is that a little bit corny? And again, it's the kind of thing, it's just a comic book, right? So it's the kind of thing you would easily forgive if you were just reading a normal comic book, if it weren't for the fact that the Sandman is built up so much as like this brilliant comic book by a real genius. That kind of heightened expectations worked against this comic in a number of ways for me. And I mean, everyone says it gets better as the series goes. So I don't know if this is an example of things that fans of this comic would say, well, okay, it's a little bit corny, but it gets better later. And then, yeah, his exit from hell seems to make no sense. So he's got the helmet. He's supposed to be able to leave hell. But then Lucifer says to him, well, I've got you surrounded by demons, so you're not leaving. Helmet or no, you have no power here. What power have dreams in hell? And he says, ask yourselves, all of you, what power would hell have if those here imprisoned were not able to dream of heaven? Okay, fair enough, good point. But then they just let him go. And Lucifer says, one day, my brothers, one day I shall destroy him. But, well, what's going on here? I mean, did he make a good point here or not? If he makes a good point, you said, okay, yeah, we need him, then we can let him go. But then why are you still talking about destroying him? And why, it seems a little bit cheap. Oh, yeah, and then here we get a epilogue here. Actually, sorry, this is one thing I forgot to mention. This is something I did like. I remember about reading comic books in the early 90s. The way little bits were teased for several issues before they finally came to prominence later. And because a lot of these comic books only came out once a month, they're teased for several issues. That could be like half a year or a year of having these slow bits teased. Was kind of the fun of having a story being told in serialization. And this comic does that quite well. Now, of course, when you're reading it all straight through, it doesn't have quite the same excitement as if you were waiting for your issue each month. But yeah, you can see here, apparently the first 8 issues were kind of all planned out as one unit. So the Sandman's tools ending up in various places was set up from the beginning and then teased throughout the rest of the comic. So, yeah, how would I rate this overall? Well, again, everyone says that these issues get really good as you go along. So one of these days, maybe once I leave Vietnam, I'll try and track down the other issues. But just reviewing this, there are some interesting things. Like I said, I used Wikipedia to catch a lot of the references to comic book continuity that I would not otherwise have caught. If you're a geek, that kind of thing is interesting to you. I think it's overpraised, but again, it's supposedly the series gets better later on. There were some really dark parts which struck me as juvenile. You know what I mean. The 15-year-old who thinks he's really deep because he's really able to go really dark. That kind of teenage edgelord stuff here with the patrons of the coffee shop all being tortured and revealing their very dark secrets before moving on to self-mutilation. Um, but interesting on the whole. Yeah. Someday maybe I'll continue with this series. Sorry, I can't seem to turn the camera off. The video's over though. You can